Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Ben Woodbury with the Friends of History and will serve as your host today. These monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History on behalf of the New Mexico History Museum and through donations from our audience. These funds go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, the History Museum's programs and exhibits. Today, we are happy to welcome as our speaker, Moises Gonzales, Associate Professor for Urban Design and the Chair of the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of New Mexico. He also serves as the Director of the Resource Center for Raza Planning, a community outreach center within the School of Architecture and Planning, whose mission is to provide technical assistance in the areas of community development, design, and natural resource planning for traditional communities throughout New Mexico. Moises has written extensively on slavery in New Mexico, with emphasis on the Genízaro community, the former mostly indigenous enslaved peoples who were partly assimilated into Spanish colonial society as menial staff. Moises, it is a pleasure to have you join us today to speak on the identity of the Genízaros and their significant role in New Mexico history since the arrival of the Spanish. And now, here is Moises Gonzales.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Friends of History for this invitation. I'm excited to talk to you all and introduce some of the work that I do and some of the things that I've written. Some of the materials that on the topic that I've written journal articles on the topic of I also write in historic preservation and vernacular architecture and planning of New Mexico, and but another area of my scholarship is Genízaro communities. Some of the books I've written, which I'll put up my PowerPoint, but just to give a little short introductions, I've written various journal articles on the topics. I've co-authored a book, Slavery in the Southwest, with Bill Pyatt. He's a professor of law at the St. Mary's University in San Antonio, and also co-edited the book Nacíon, Genízara, with Enrique La Madrid. We have a wonderful cast of authors in that anthology. I've written chapters in various books that contain the topic. One of the books that might be of interest is the book Querencia, which was released last year, another anthology, and I have a chapter in there connecting the concept of Querencia and how it's centered in Genízaro culture and identity. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. So this first slide is basically gives you some information of the anthology I co-edited with Enrique, and it's called Nacíon Genízara. You can get it through UNM Press, or you can also order it through Amazon. There's both a hard copy and a soft copy version. And so it was released in fall 2019. And it's had some quite success, especially with folks interested in identity in the Southwest and communities. And so it's been used for text in both history courses, anthropology courses, cultural landscape courses, courses surrounding Indigenous studies, Native American studies, Chicano studies. So we're really happy about how it's been received. It won an award by the New Mexico State Historic Preservation Office for it shining the light on the importance of Genízaro communities and their importance to just the cultural diversity of New Mexico, but specifically, where these communities are located, they actually are very important historic cultural landscapes that also give exposure to the type of architecture and and town planning of high mountain communities. So I'll get into that in a little bit. Um, so um, um, I want to mention if we look at the type of, so first of all, I'm going to talk about kind of the role in which Genízaro communities evolved and how they came about, right? So if you look at, if you look at the history of New Mexico after the Pueblo Revolt, a lot of, Popé, horses were going out into the frontier before, at different times, even probably before the Pueblo Revolt. I mean, this could probably been ever since the beginning, the first onset of colonization in New Mexico by Don Juan Oñate, right? So, but thinking about maybe what kind of uh, things happened during the Pueblo Revolt. So, if you look at the Pueblo Revolt, Popé wanted to turn Pueblo society back to, it's a pre-colonial state. So a lot of actually animals were pushed into, like sheep were pushed into, sheep and horses were pushed into, the territory of the Navajos, which is broadly the western New Mexico and out towards northwestern New Mexico. If you think about it, in the Apache areas to western New Mexico, and horses were, pushed into east, west, south, almost in every direction. So we look at like how nomadic and semi-nomadic indigenous communities were able to transform these, kind of the use of the horse. For the Navajo, it was definitely the sheep and animals, horses as well. But if you think about the Utes to the north and into the northwest, in terms of how they became one of the greatest known equestrian cultures, along with the Comanche, which were pretty much up into the Taos region, northeastern New Mexico. And basically, if you think about the Gran Comancheria, stretched from basically Edgewood, um, Moriarty area, all the way down to northern Mexico, western Oklahoma, western Texas. So it was, and even uh, eastern Colorado for that matter. So we think about, kind of what happened. So you have the Pueblo Revolt at these times, these nomadic and semi-nomadic populations were basically at the edge of Pueblo country. So when De Vargas comes back, going into the early 18th century, there was quite an amount of raids that threatening the province of New Mexico. So if we think about the militias that were organized between both early Hispanic communities or New Mexican communities, along with the Pueblos, in terms of an alliance to kind of protect settlements at the territories of the borderlands, right? The New Mexico borderlands, and which were the borderlands of nomadic and semi-nomadic populations. So each community lands up. So then what happened is um, um, you have basically a lot of raids between the the Hispanic Pueblo communities um, in terms of protecting against raids, but also doing retaliatory raids on nomadic communities. So in this process, if you get to, by the time you get to the early 18th century, you have basically a large population of kids and women that were the product of these battles that were living kind of basically um, some were kind of lived as servants in wealthy Hispanic families, and some of them landed up being like a vagabond nomadic kind of their own population, just circling within, kind of in the areas around Santa Cruz, Santa Fe, Albuquerque. And so you had a series of governors that were really trying to create, because you had this growing population that was outside of the Hispanic population and outside of the the population of the pueblos. So governors had a hard time because they would initially there was some plans to put Genízaros in pueblos, and the pueblos are like, no, they're not like us. And then a lot of the some Hispanic, the ones that were utilized as servants, of course, were used as labor. And then you had a growing population that was basically landless. So I think by the time you get to one particular governor, his name was Tomás Vélez Gachupin, and he was the one that I would say was the creator of the created this architecture and urban planning concept of getting Genízaros, of these populations of nomadic and semi-nomadic population, to put them as literally strategic fortress around New Mexico. And so there was, and utilizing the land grant system to move these populations to these areas. So I'm going to go through a series of slides that highlight some of the communities. I'd like to start with some photos of the dances, because I think, interesting enough, sometimes we think of Genízaros in the past, and we are basically exist in the present. And a lot of people, when they don't learn about Genízaro history, they don't understand the relationship to land and land grants and why we were settled. So I'm starting with Taos, but Taos actually wasn't the first, and I'll go a little bit about the history. The first Genízaro settlement, and it's there's another article that I have. You might probably find it online. It's called the land grants, the Genízaro land grant settlements of New Mexico, and it was published in the Journal of the Southwest, I believe in 2013, 2014. And so I talk about kind of like the evolution of some of these settlements. So Belen was actually the first. The idea with Belen in the 1740s was that you could create a settlement that would buffer a lot of the Pacheria populations around that were around hot Ojo Caliente or Warm Springs, or generally the Socorro area. And also, Comanches were also known to raid through that area. So in 1740, Belen ends up being the first land grant primarily granted to Genízaros. And in fact, if you look at the history of settlements, a couple of well-known settlements in the Belen area, where there was actually a plaza called the Plaza de los Genízaros. And so that was the first land grant. So you have that strategically placed. Then the next well-known land grant that becomes a Genízaro land grant is the San Miguel Elvado, not San Miguel Elvado, the Abiquiu land grant, the Pueblo de Abiquiu. And so let me just go through some of these slides, and then I'll come back to talking about some of these settlements. So also, then after that, you had the Serna land grant, which Taos, the Serna land grant is basically Rancho de Taos. Rancho de Taos is known because it's relationship to the Comanche dances, the buffalo hunts, trade with early on a lot of skirmishes with Comanche, but Taos Pueblo is actually one of the most storied trade fairs with the Comanche. So you have a lot of rich Genízaro culture that arrives through this exchange. This is the Pueblo of Abiquiu. Again, Pueblo of Abiquiu was established in the 1750s. So this is demonstrating their type of dance. So if we look at going back to the type of dance that's done in Comanche dances that's done in ranchos, is a little bit different, more influence directly from the Comanche, where you have the Pueblo of Abiquiu has a kind of a rich connection to its Pueblo history, but also has layers of its relationship to the Ute and the Navajo, right? So if we look at the history of Abiquiu, it's established in the 1750s. And the governor at the time, well, the reason it was kind of established is because if you remember when after the Pueblo Revolt, then there was another another revolt that happened with I believe it was 1696 with the Tano Pueblo. So a lot of Tewas and Tanos actually left, abandoned to live in Hopi. Well, there was, I believe, 14 families that wanted to come back to Abiquiu and that were moved from Hopi back to Moke. So the Abiquiu Land Grant was established for receiving the Moke. And if you know, the Moke is the word Hopi, right? And that's why the Spanish usually called the Hopi Moquinos, right? They were the Hopi people. So some Hopi Tewas had come back, wanted to come back to their lands, and the land grant, and so it was strategic that basically Abiquiu could be established, because if you look at the geography of New Mexico, the Rio Chama adjoins the Rio Grande, and then of course you have the Santa Cruz that eventually forms attached to the Rio Grande. So defending and putting a strategic settlement in the Rio Chama area would, on the frontier of the Utes and the Navajo, was the idea of to form that protection for that border, for that area of the borderlands. Early on, Abiquiu has really two historic villages, if you know the village. I should just to talk a little bit my background. I'm a member of I live in Carnué. That's where my dad's from, which I'll get to the history of Carnué. But my mom was from, my mom's side, my grandpa's from the Pueblo of Abiquiu, and roots through the Archuletas and the Gallego side to Abiquiu. And so I have a little bit internal knowledge from just my family background and my kinship ties to Abiquiu, right? So it's interesting the way Abiquiu's establishment of a village was very interesting, because the upper village was originally they call it the Pueblo de Moque, which is the Hopi part, the Pueblo part of the village. And then a completely fortified plaza was formed in Abiquiu in compliance to the laws of the Indies. So if you ever go to Abiquiu, you can see the form of the plaza. The original church was actually rebuilt. So we're seeing this dance, which is very Pueblo influenced, has probably some Ute influences as well. And you're seeing the dancers and the singer and the drummer leaving the church at Abiquiu, which the original church, I mean, wasn't the church that we're seeing here wasn't the original church. It was actually redone in the 40s, and it's a John Gamim designed church. And if you know John Gamim, about, kind of like a leader in Pueblo revival architecture, really was prolific in the UNM's plan of campus master plan, which was to be kind of situated in Pueblo revival type of architecture. And so today, if you go on the feast of Santo Tomas, which is always the Saturday after Thanksgiving, you'll see the dances and the processional dances, and it's a beautiful thing to see. So again, I'm going to go back to just talking about more history, but I want to kind of give you examples of the cultural identity. This is one of our dances. So we have a couple dances that are emblematic of Carnué. So my community is Cañón de Carnué, and it's established in 1763. Which so we going through some of these timelines, so you can kind of get a picture of how this whole buffer settlement pattern around pueblos and Hispanic villages of the Rio Grande Valley are formed. So Cañón de Carnué is established at the kind of at the edge of the Gran Comancheria. So if you think about the Comanches, some of the passes that they favored to raid in New Mexico was obviously the Abo Pass into the Belen area. The other major pass was the Cañón de Carnué, also known today as Tejeres Canyon. Another crucial pass was north of the Sandias, which I'll talk another settlement out there. Of course, then you had into the pass at Galisteo. And so you think of all these, you look at like the entrance to Taos for Ranchos de Taos and Taos Pueblo, and then Abacu. So you're starting to see these, this kind of architecture, right? So Cañón de Carnué is the word Carnué comes from a mispronounced word. So a lot of these villages are like that, right? So Abacu comes from the word abechu, which means chokecherry in Tewa. Carnué comes from the word carné, which was Hispanicized, which means badger place. So referring to, at one point there probably was populated by badgers and other many wildlife as it does today. The original village of Carnué, we know this through investigations. There's a report that's circulating, I believe, combined online, or maybe if you email me, I could give you access to that. We recently had an archaeological study done by Professor Callie Jinks at New Mexico State a few years ago. And I mean, it just kind of repeated some ideas, things that we knew, but it was great to get evidence that's beside actually some of the land grant historic documents, but also, that kind of solidified even oral history, right? So Carnué was originally had a Tiwa Pueblo there. It's part of the series of pueblos that were in this region that were Tiwa. We know that through the archaeology studies that Professor Jinks worked on, is that somehow before the Pueblo Revolt there was also was kind of like a refugee pueblo made of various different pueblos, because it was out of the side of kind of the encomienda system, or the kind of the system of tribute. So it was kind of like a refuge pueblo for a while, mixed with probably curious Tiwa and other folks in the area, maybe Tompito or Pito, because the archaeological evidence that she found was kind of this mixed, kind of like different groups that probably were occupying. Then was abandoned probably before the Pueblo Revolt. The original Tiwa Pueblo, what is pretty understood is that it probably faced a lot of different challenges, like Tijeras Pueblo, and one of our upper villages called San Antonio, and it was built on top of a pueblo. So a lot of those pueblos became probably threatened by a lot of the Apache raids that would happen. And we know, like the Salinas Pueblos, they suffered to tribute and of labor, and how they, in terms of how they had to build those churches, and they were not doing their salt gathering, and they weren't going hunting, and then of course they were getting raided really bad by probably by Apache and Comanche groups, which led them to migrate into Isleta and abandon that area. So we think about, by the time Carnué is established as a land grant, there are basically no settlements east of Albuquerque, because they're completely, they have already been completely impacted by years of raids by nomadic and semi-nomadic groups. So that's why it's strategic to put a settlement in that canyon. The original land grant in 1763 was established primarily of Genízaros, and we know through the record and the archaeology that suggests that was the population. Even the mestizos that we found out that were categorized, or what they call coyotes, through genealogical surveys, we know that they were mainly, some of them were actually a pueblo, but probably were for whatever reason categorized. So the majority were Genízaros with a couple other castas in there. We know that in order to a lot of these settlements, if they were of more nomadic, made up of nomadic and semi-nomadic roots, they had to adopt Catholicism and be Catholic. So then that's why so that's why a lot of our matriarchal lines landed up coming from Isla de Pueblo and Sandia Pueblo actually as well. So what we're watching this dance that I have in this image, it's a photo of our version of our Comanche dances. And if our Comanche dances are done right before the week before Christmas, because that's when symbolics kind of like the oral history. So culturally, again, focusing on us as Genízaros living in the day and not in the past, is a lot of our dances tell stories, right? So the Comanche dances in Taos talk about the relationship and battles and then again alliances with the Comanche. Ours does a similar thing, as our Comanches tell the stories of our Comanche dances. They're the way so. It symbolizes when the men would leave on the buffalo hunts from the village in Carnué and the upper village San Antonio. So basically, what happened after our feast of San Miguel, which was September 29th, um, after the feast of San Miguel, the men would get prepared, and they would go on the buffalo hunts, and they would leave on the buffalo hunts from the start of October, and they wouldn't come back till around Christmas time. So what they would do is they would follow the buffalo hunts and whatnot. Then when they would come back, it's story that we at that time we were eventually became allies with the Comanche, and so we would meet the Comanche in Palo Verde, which would be present day, kind of around Amarillo, Texas. There's actually a Palo Verde State Park, and we would trade. And then when we would come back, we would bring back. Actually, when our ancestors were there, our relatives were there, they would trade with the Comanche. So they would take out dry chili. We were really involved in salt gathering. Carnuel's basic, most important commodity was salt, because if you think about, we're the oldest East Mountain community, and other land grants come later. But we're, basically we fill the void where, the Salinas Pueblos were gathering a lot of salt out by the salt lakes by Quarai, Abo, and Gran Quivira. So we leveraged that economic trading potential using salt. So over the summer, a lot of folks would gather salts. But then again, when we would meet the Comanche in the plains, we would trade salt. We trade any sort of metal objects because steel and metal was actually hard to come by in colonial times. So any sort of those sort of kind of pieces of metal, salt, red chili, those kind of things were traded with the Comanche. Horses. And what was interesting is then we would trade for women and children, and we would bring those back, and we would come back in October, and they would come back in December. And so our version of Comanche actually symbolizes when we would bring captives back, and our form of Comanche is basically set in as a captive initiation dance. Then a lot of those servants would go and also be primed on the slave markets, right? And it's kind of interesting. Although we were the products of slavery, we became the people that actually primed. We were the buffalo traders, the Comancheros, the ciboleros that would, that were based. Our economy was based on the slave trade, but also the buffalo meat and the buffalo hides, because the buffalo hides were also very sought after in colonial times, because a lot of clothing was made out of buffalo hides. And so if you know Horteras Canyon, and it's pretty rugged, we didn't have very big acequias. We didn't have the big farm plots. In fact, our upper village of San Antonio was built in a very in the laws of the Indies fashion. It was completely walled and had a church in the middle. And it was built to fortify, because we couldn't have the large numbers of animals to graze out into, in the forest, because if you think about the Mescalero territory, it's basically from the Manzanos and Carnué all the way to the mountains outside of El Paso. That was the large territory of the Mescalero. And then northeast of us was the Jicarilla. Somehow we were more aligned through kinship through the Jicarilla, but we actually had a lot of battles with the Mescalero and bands of Mescaleros. So we couldn't, it's a myth when you talk about what's written in environmental history about mountain land grants, exceeding, and you hear the thing that the tragedy of the commons. That to me is not historically factual, because we didn't depend on our land grant as grazing communities until the forced relocation of the Jicarilla, the Comanche, the Mescaleros, because no way would we have large amounts of grazing animals, because we could only have as many animals as when the raids happen that you could fit in the plaza. So, and the plaza was not very big. According to the documents, the land grant documents, it was basically a 50 vara by 50 vara plaza. So that's, that if you think about that plaza, that's a lot smaller than, say, the Albuquerque plaza or the Santa Fe plaza, because those were laid out at 100 by 100 varas. So it was much tighter of a plaza. So the dance in our community signifies that history. So again, talking to the living current history of Genízaros, the dance that we do is emblematic of the history of slave trades and buffalo hunts. Another dance that we do, it's similar to the Pueblo, as Pueblos do the matachinas. I think is one of the broadest dances in Mexico and in the Southwest is the form of the dance called the matachinas. And there are other forms in Mexico. It takes in different forms. It takes the form of danza la pluma or danza de Montezuma, because in essence, I'll go into talking about the dance. The dance of the matachinas is very rooted in kind of like it kind of represents also our Genízaro background, but it also kind of hinges on the links between our Genízaro identity and our connection to Catholicism. And I'll come back to that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. If you see this dance, it's danced throughout the Pueblo feasts, largely done in the northern Pueblos around Christmas. Ours is interesting. We dance on Comanches in the winter, but we're different. We do our matachinas in the summer. And we have a Feast of San Antonio and the Feast of Santa Cruz, which is Holy Cross Day. And then we also do one in one of the smaller villages in the Carnué Land Grant called Cañoncito, and we dance for San Lorenzo Day. This dance is very interesting because if you look at the version or the way it's storied in Jemez Pueblo, Jemez Pueblo contributes that they've done the matachinas before the Spanish got here in some form, because they did it to honor Montezuma, who is the central character, one of the central characters of the dance. So for us, it's important to recognize, for us, the Comanche dances is not a public dance. It's not performed related to. It is related to a saint. We dance it to Santo Niño. So we dance in honor of Santo Niño, which is Santo Niño comes at Christmas, right? And then the one thing that it's linked to the Catholic Church or Catholic mixed of the Catholic consciousness and the Genízaro indigenous consciousness is in the Comanches. We have a saint there, and we actually have the hermanos, the penitentes, the hermandad. Our hermanos will actually lead a procession, and then we do the dance. Where it's not as seen under related to the church, where when we dance the Matachinas, it's based on the Catholic feast day, and the dance is done several times during the day with the final dance called Ensaya, which is usually around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Um, so, um, and what's important about the dance is, again, it's done by the Raramuri, the Yaqui do it, the Pueblos do it, various communities in northern Mexico do it, and Mexico. What I think really happened is for us, and I can speak for my community, that for a while, and we do know that in other places, the Matachinas was only one of the only allowed dances in indigenous communities. For example, if you have the Yaquis, they have their gear dance, and then they have their Matachinas. So if you go out to places like Guadalupe, in Arizona, or you go to the other Yaqui reservation in the Yaqui reservation outside of Tucson, during Holy Week, you'll see both of these dances simultaneously danced during Holy Week. So, the dance is definitely kind of like plays on indigenous and colonial or Christian um, um, representation. So to put it in a nutshell, and I'll move on to some other communities briefly, is the Matachinas, they usually have 12 dancers, and they symbolize they kind of symbolize the 12 disciples, but more importantly, they exemplify the rulers, or the capitanes or captains, or the leaders of the various regions of the Aztec Empire, right? And that's kind of what the symbology is. Then the main dancer, who you see standing at the middle of the dance line, who's standing and has his palma to on his shoulder, that represents Montezuma. And in the dance, and then we have other adaptations in our form of the Matachinas in the mountains. We have a Perejunia, which you see is a man dressed as a woman clown. And then we have an abuelo clown, and we also have a character called the toro, who represents evil. So basically, our dance has 7 versions of the dance to complete the story that's being told. So in the dance, the main dancers are keeping rhythm, because it's believed that all the rhythm and the dancers simultaneously keeping harmony is a blessing to the community, but also as a blessing and connection to if the dancers are in harmony, then the community is in harmony, and that's in harmony with. And then the church is in harmony, but it even goes beyond the church's belief. We're kind of like in harmony with humanity and the universe, right? So that's kind of the indigenous kind of component. Then one interesting part of the dance is called La Conversación. That part of the dance is we have a Malinche. And yes, the Malinche is the character that assisted as a translator of Cortez. But in our version, she's very honored. It's a very, the symbology is that she represents the purity of herself, and her purity of keeping the community in harmony, right? And then, so there's one form of the dance, and you could see in Bernalillo. You also see it maybe if you see you'll see it almost any Taos Pueblo. You'll see that this one part of the dance where the Malinche actually gets her the rattle and the palma that Montezuma has, and she blesses Montezuma's hand, and that's at the point where Montezuma becomes converted from basically into the Catholic faith. And then you also have the other danzantes. There's another part of the dance where the Malinche and the Perejunia, the ancient grandmother, start weaving through all the dancers, and it's this time that there's a conversion from into Catholicism, but it's really blended, right? Because there's also some indigenous themes. And so anyway, I believe I just kind of also want to connect that that these communities have living history. This is a community of alcalde, and where they dance matachinas as well. And every community will have its own story on what it's telling, and the symbology. And if you're tapped into the nuance, basically these dances are telling the history of our community and how we in this exist as Genízaros with an indigenous consciousness. Um, and so this is the Matachinas in Alcalde. It's danced on December 26th and December 27th outside of near Okeawinge Pueblo. And if you ever seen some of these matachinas, the bull actually looks like a form of a bull, like in our form of dances. And then in this if you see that this form of the abuelo, that represents the abuelo. He's the ancient grandfather. He's trying to maintain order, and the bull that they kill is creating disorder, right? But what's interesting is the year that I took this picture, you have the bull is not dressed as necessarily a typical bull that you would see in other years. He's dressed as a Comanche child, right? And you can barely see it, but if you look at the horn that the little Comanchito, the little Comanche dancer is wearing, you can barely see it, but he has a green horn coming from the horn, green horn attached to the band that's tied around the head. Well, that's emblematic of Cuerno Verde, right? So it's interesting because here in Alcalde, they're placing a Comanche child in a role of the dances, and they're also remembering the story or the relationship with the Comanche with Chief Cuerno Verde. So if you remember, the turning point for Comanche trade and what they call in history books, the Comanche Ute alliance with the Spanish really kind of occurred when De Anza gets the militia, the Pueblo, Hispanic, and even some Genízaro militia. They go up in 1776 into what is present-day southern Colorado to defeat Cuerno Verde. I've always wondered if Greenhorn mountain outside of Pueblo, if that's the reason, if that's near where it actually happened, because that mountain's called Greenhorn, Cuerno Verde. So after De Anza beats Cuerno Verde, he is able to form an alliance between the Utes and the Comanche, and after that time, the Utes and Comanche can trade peacefully with the villages in New Mexico as long as they're not raiding. So and then what that did is that primed the slave markets even more intense, right? Because the Utes now are bringing in Paiute captives, right? The Comanche are bringing Kiowa captives, or they're bringing Apache captives to the slave markets, right? So all this exchange in the 18th century and the early 19th century is really how Genízaro population is projected. In fact, some scholars cite that if you take the class of Genízaro, Coyote, and other mixed class, that combined the population of Genízaros could have been as high as 1/3 of the population by the late 18th century, right? So that's thinking about the scale of that. So here we come to right. These are communities that we know that had large population. So I mentioned Belen on this map. You could see it on the south. Valencia and Tomé had large populations of Genízaros. And even today, if you go to the placard, there's a historic New Mexico placard at Valencia recognizing the amount of Genízaro population there. And you could see then Atrisco, even though it wasn't primarily seen as Genízaro population, they do dances. Some families do Comanche dances there. And that's because there was such a high population of a servant class in that community, along with the Rio Puerco. Also in Bernalillo, Las Huertas was kind of also formed very similar to Carnué. because um, the raids that were happening through Carnué, through to Harris Canyon, once, I mean, let's say if you um, create a distraction or limit or minimize the ability to raid to Carnué, well, then the Comanche and the Jicarilla were just coming in north of the Sandia. So then you had to form that. A critical community, one of the last Genízaro communities to be established is, and it's on the map and you could see it, San Miguel del Vado. Well, if we think about when the Comanche for so long had weakened Pecos Pueblo, right? And then during the Comanche Peace Accord, well, you still had a lot of Jicarilla raids into Pecos. So the kind of the depletions of how difficult it was for the Pueblo of Pecos to sustain itself. That's when we hear it was the last folks at Pecos had migrated to Jemez. So it left Santa Fe very vulnerable to raids. So in the so San Miguel del Valle, right at the turn of the 18th century, was established because the governors felt it was really vulnerable. So what they did is they basically the governor, there was a lot of Genízaros living in San Miguel by the San Miguel Plaza, which is the south side of Santa Fe. So a lot of Genízaros were recruited, landless people that were living as pretty much peasants and servants in Santa Fe were recruited to populate San Miguel del Vado. It's pretty interesting, and I've noted it in some of my articles and in different times, where it's interesting because in the early 1800s they asked for a permanent priest at San Miguel del Vado because they made the claim that so many Comanche were coming into the community that they needed they needed a permanent priest because so many Comanche were joining the community. And also we know that along with the landless Genízaros that landed up in San Miguel del Valle, there were also some Pecos families that didn't migrate to Jemez. So we have to acknowledge that some of the early families were also of Pecos Pueblo background. So then Analco, I have Analco. Analco is the settlement where San Miguel del Vado sits. So that landed up being one. We also know San Miguel del Pueblo Quemado. The town of Pueblo Quemado, the town of Cordova in between Truchas and Chimayo, it actually had a lot. It had a Tano population that didn't leave. So that's why, and it's interesting because when they were getting Genízaros to establish the Rancho de Taos village, which is way to the north. That was established because they took people from Pueblo Quemado and other Genízaros because the Ranchos de Taos was under constant attack, so they had to make sure they had the populations of Genízaros to sustain it. I've already talked about Abiquiu, but interesting to note is Ojo Caliente, because you had people migrating back and forth from Ranchos de Taos and Abiquiu, that it was almost a porous population at Ojo Caliente. I mentioned Alcalde. And then an interesting community to note is Trampas, because you had a lot of Genízaros at Truchas and other places, but they formed that Las Trampas could be attributed to forming the Genízaro population. So by the time you get to the Mexican period, you basically have finally the making of this borderland Genízaro network that was important that not provided settlements for Genízaros as places to live and places to build their lives and their homes and their communities. It also created it was again a military goal that took quite many years. You know, we talk about 1840. I mean, not time 1740 with Belen, and you push that all the way up to the around the settlements of the 1800s, like San Miguel of Vardo, right around the turn. So it took a while to build it out. We could say about, what's 40s, probably what, 60, 70 years. So what we talk a lot, the scholars that look at Genízaro communities, and one of my mentors is Benito Cordova. He was a relative. He's passed. He was probably one of the premier scholars of Genízaro culture and identity. And the difference between him as being one of the first, the reason it's important that he was one of the first is because he participated and grew up around the culture of being Genízaro. So I'd say, because at the time, his dissertation was in the early 70s, and the only really folks there were very few scholars that were centering on Genízaros. The other scholar that comes up to mind is Fray Angelico Chavez. Fray Angelico Chavez is interesting because he writes a lot of Genízaros because he's finding them in the records and he's describing them. Well, I think it's I cited a lot. I believe it was 1979 when the article came out. So two things is happening. Benito Cordova is finishing his dissertation in anthropology, and he's finishing his dissertation in anthropology, and his dissertation's on Genízaros in the Pueblo of Abiquiu. It's great. It's groundbreaking work. And he talks about, how the land grants were established, how cultural systems were established, how religious systems were hybrids of Catholic and Pueblo Navajo influences, right? At the same time, Fray Angelico Chavez wrote the chapter on Genízaros for the Handbook of American Indians, which is good in the sense that it put Genízaros in the map in the Handbook of American Indians. So that was saying, hey, no, Genízaros did exist. The one thing that the Genízaro scholars have kind of criticized Benito a little bit, not Benito, Fray Angelico, because he talked about us in the past as opposed to living in the present. And so that's always, because in his article, he's in the Handbook of American Indians, he states that Genízaros were the descendants of Genízaros that live in Hispanic form today. And I think, and so a lot of his Genízaros in Genízaro communities have also always thought, maybe we've been perceived as living a Hispanic lifestyle, but we also honor our indigenous belief system. Benito would argue that we live Genízaros, and he writes about this. There's a great book where he has a fiction book. It's called Great Dreams, Dark Secrets, where he gets in. It's a fiction book, but it's kind of like based on Genízaro, what we call Genízaro consciousness. So when we talk about race and identity, a lot of Genízaros are, in terms of some of the scholars and some of the books that are based in what we call Genízaro consciousness through culture. And Benito, my mentor, taught me this. He said, we are not mestizos, because if we are mestizos, we are part of the success of the colonial project. Because the success of the colonial project from the get-go was to create the mestizaje. And the mestizaje would brand the Spanish and the Indian, but however, the Indian wouldn't be celebrated necessarily. Basically, right? The difference between Genízaro consciousness is like, yeah, we're mixed, definitely mixed some Spanish, definitely mixed with Pueblo, and we definitely come from our nomadic and some semi-nomadic roots. For especially Carnué is very based on relationships with Apaches through warfare, and then of course Comanche through relationships, but having our start through Pueblo matriarchs, right? However, the difference is, and Benito's so brilliant on this, he goes, the Genízaro consciousness exists because we believe we are still Genízaro, and we are still in contradiction to the colonial project. So don't call me a mestizo, is what Benito would say. And that's the difference, because a lot of people say, well, what's the difference from all these identity and terms? In his book, let me go back, because this is an interesting, important historic and scholarly uh, uh, detail, right? It's important to note that I don't think um, Fray Angelico Chavez totally didn't get us, or didn't say and wrote that, because he kind of contradicts him. And I'm okay with the contradiction. Sometimes, we look at something as a hair, and and we over dissect it and over analyze the split of the hair, right? Well, in his book, the This Penitente Land, or Penitente Land, forget the exact title. I should do that. Fray Angelico's book, he goes really deep in describing Genízaros, and he says, you know what, they've always kind of have done their own thing. He even points out that in My Penitente Land, in that book, he describes that the Genízaros were part of their own project, and that we were the ones living in the mountain communities supporting Reyes Tejerina and the Chicano movement. And he says this because the Genízaros are supporting the Chicano movement and the land grant movement because they're more Indian-like in their thinking. And I think it's interesting why he puts that we're more Indian-like than our thinking. And that's where we have strong ties to the land, and why we were part of the land grant, our land grant movement. If you look at those communities, we're still land grant communities. Abacu's a land grant, Carnué's a land grant, Las Huertas is a land grant, San Miguel Vado, we're all land grants. And so we're still part of this land grant struggle and land grant movement that exists. So where does this Genízaro consciousness become from? And we found it very important to put in the book. Found it very important to detail in the book. It's the concept, or talk about in the book, but actually use it in the name. Genízaro ethnogenesis. Ethnogenesis is an important concept. It goes throughout history. The Greeks used it. The Greeks, it's when a group of people has a collective history, a collective culture, that they say, we are of these people, right? If you look at, what creates the consciousness of Pueblo people? What creates the consciousness that I am, people that are Comanche, or people that are Ute, people that are, that are Roman, or, Greek is a good example, right? Well, a lot of Genízaro scholars are kind of agreement to this one fundamental question. When did Genízaros themselves start believing that they were Genízaros, right? Because it's not a term we called ourselves, right? It's a term that the Spanish government and the priests were referring to primarily to nomadic and semi-nomadic people that were living in communities, right? Well, what happens, so we can look at this document that you're seeing, and it's the petition for the Sandia tract, the Sandia Pueblo tract in 1733. And this is the document that we kind of refer to the first time when Genízaros is saying, you know what, we are a collective people. And so what's going on here is maybe you can read the title. I hope you can. It says Nómina de los Genízaros que son dispersos en el reino de Nuevo México. So these are the names of the Genízaros that were dispersed through New Mexico. And so basically there's a document that this is the part of the document. And basically what it does is it's listing the people who are applying for the Sandia tract. Just like Abacu, the Tiwas and some of the Curies or primarily the Tiwas that landed up in Hopi wanted to come back as well. So just like Abiquiu, before Abiquiu, they wanted to come back and establish the Sandia Pueblo, which was their original home or part of the one. So it would have, before it was vacant, a group of Genízaros got together and they probably got a scribe, and they said, we want to apply for the Pueblo tract so we could become a land grant. We could have land. We won't be wandering the region homeless or like a vagabond population. And the these governors really wanted to do these Genízaro land grants. And what happened, this particular one was denied because the priest wanted to relocate the Tihuas back to Sandia Pueblo. If you recall, so Sandia Pueblo was given a land grant at that time. Then what we find out, a lot of this population that were on these families, they land up in places like later on in Carnué. They land up places like Belen, Valencia, some in Berlin, some not in Berlin, some in Las Huertas. And it's pretty easy. It's pretty interesting if you look at some of the names of the document. So if you see Antonio Gurule, and he's marked the first one, and you could see some of these tribal designations. So we have everything from Apache, Comanche to Pawnee. So if you look at the one below, I think it's family 5, Antonio Padilla, Panana. Panana is Pawnee, right? We have Humanos. So we have basically folks of various backgrounds, either just listed as Genízaro, or they are, and this is the second page of the families. If we go to another Juan Antonio Godolea, who's my ancestor, he's also listed as Pawnee, right? And then you go down. There's the single ones that aren't married. You have Pawnee. You have one Antonio Andres Martins. We have Francisco, I believe it's Garcia, and it's Humano. So the Humano Pueblos were out in the Salinas area. So what's interesting about this document that's attached to this document, which I think is fantastic, is that that we can point to this as Genízaro ethnogenesis. In their petition, they say that the Spanish communities, the Hispanic communities, don't want the Genízaros because they're not like them. They also argue that we do not want to be with the Pueblos, and they even go to in fact to describe that the Pueblos talk about you all too. They don't like you all either. So what they're doing is they're making the case to establish their own communities, and they eventually, most of them land up going in places. They land up, like I said, in the Carnué Land Grant. In these people, particular Carnué and Valencia, and Belen. And and it's not interesting because, like I said, some of our Genízaros were from these communities, from this petition. Our ancestors landed up in Las Huertas and Carnué, because I'm also a member of the Las Huertas land grant, because my dad's mom was from Carnué. And her mom was from Carnué, and her dad was from Placitas. My grandpa, his mom was from Carnué, and his dad was from Placitas. So anyway, a lot of intermarriage between Las Huertas and Carnué, which really was an extension of these families. Again, I want to show you these maps that kind of place Las Huertas and Carnué. You could see the map. Chile's misquoted on this map. This is a Maria Pacheco map. That was actually the Pueblo of San Antonio. But you can see through this cutout, how strategic these communities are to the frontier. And they even say in this map, this was a map of in the 1770s by Maria Pacheco. It says that fronteras y entradas de los enemigos comanches, right? That's interesting. So we could find through the record, this is Antonio Gurule, who was the son, and he was married to Elena Gallegos, who ended up being the matriarch of the Elena Gallegos land grant. you could see in the census that Antonio Goudelet and Eleni Gallegos, they had 2 servants, and each of them had 6 kids, and they were both Indian, right? So it just shows you the scale. This person is one of my relatives, and he is Salvador Goudelet. And it's interesting because in his one marriage, he's cited as an Indian, and the next one he's Genízaro. So it's interesting how, how this happened. Well, Salvador lands up being part of the census. There was a military census in Las Huertas for some reason, and there are several some of these Genízaro families. So the Salvador, who's I cited, it was interesting because not all of them stayed, didn't have some means as they became upwardly mobile. Because, like, for example, we have a Goudelet. Oh shoot, we have a Goudelet person. Let me go back one slide. Or we have a number of people that are in this military census, and they're designated with not being able to defend themselves by bow and arrow. Where if you go to Salvador or these ones in Placitas at the top, you can see Las Huertas. These folks in Genízaros in Las Huertas were pretty well to do because they had escopetas, which is basically a rifle. They had a lance, horses, and mules. So escopetas, to have an escopeta was pretty, and how did they get it? Did they trade? Because these weapons were hard to get in the area. I mean, were they trading with the Comanche, or were some of these, being smuggled in through tribes that were trading with the French? It's pretty fascinating. I want to put a good book to read because I think he challenges this idea of what I call, the Spanish fantasy identity, right? So in this book called by John Nieto Phillips, I would read it. He talks about how the whole making of Spanish American identity was created in New Mexico, and how it was kind of linked to the starting of the Santa Fe fiestas, the Española fiestas, and how Mexican heritage, and especially Genízaro heritage, was not going to be acknowledged because the amount of racism that exists when New Mexico is becoming a state. New Mexico couldn't be a state until the Anglo population exceeded the Mexican and the Indian population. That's why it took so long. So he really dissects the history, right? This is a picture of my relatives in Las Huertas that actually have a form of Comanchitos as well. And so I just want to read a quote from Atherton's 2013 dissertation in Placitas. She goes, oral histories corroborate this disquiet through narrative of raiding, abduction, slavery, and even death. Nevertheless, a number of these one-time enemies became respected community and family members after being captured and acculturated into the Spanish colonial lifestyle. The relationships in which villagers of San Jose de las Huertas illustrates the complexity of negotiating daily life in the 18th and 19th century in New Mexico. So thank you so much. And if you have a question.
Thank you very much, Moises, for providing this fine perspective on the identity and role of Genízaros in New Mexico history. You have offered notable insights into the complexity of New Mexican society in the past and its continuation today by presenting this lesser known aspect of New Mexico history. I do have a few questions. How is the growing understanding of Genízaro community, to which your book has been a major contribution, helped in reshaping the long-held view of New Mexico society as a trilateral culture of Anglo, Spanish, and Native American cultures?
Thank you, Ben, for this invitation. It's been great to be part of your community. I think what I think a lot of, not just my own scholarship. There's some great scholars out there. But I think where the contribution of this sort of scholarship or this work or research and is broadening the knowledge of and really challenging the notion of culture. I'm not the first, right? Definitely my mentor Benito Cordova was already doing this. Edward Dozier was actually, I had to put his as a Pueblo scholar. He, from Santa Clara, in his book, The Pueblos of North America, he writes a lot about and mentions Genízaro. I just think it just wasn't well known. So I think now that we have certain types of books, we can get them out to different materials. For example, the public education department is now wanting to use part of the book and maybe as to offer it to teachers, and they're wanting to. There's another film right now you could watch it. It's called The Genízaro Experience, and it's on New Mexico PBS. It's about an hour long, and you can just Google Genízaro Experience at NMPBS, and it'll pop up. And so a lot of that film is also making an impact by Gary Medina Cook. Also shows these different communities. So I think what's at the heart of this research is telling the story of of how maybe not aware at the complexity of identity in New Mexico, such as, a lot of folks don't know the history of the mountain towns and how they were created. So this kind of tricultural myth gets locked into. And I think what Genízaro communities do, like we've always done, we said, hey, we have our own consciousness and our own culture and our own identity, and it's different.
Well, thank you. Women and children were the major, as I understand it, the major share of captives who were placed in servitude during the colonial period through capture and enslavement. Over time, what has been the role of women in preserving Genízaro culture?
Well, I think it's it's paramount because in terms of the makeup of ritual dances, like for example, there's a particular dances that this culture of where certain dances are based on the role of women, and the women dancers actually portray those in the dances. So, people, I think also within the dances, I think the memory of women and the contributions of women in the ethnogenesis and the relation that in our consciousness is very important. I mean, even like the way the ancient grandma is portrayed in the Matachinas, along with the memory. I mean, if we talk about captivity, let's talk about La Malinche. She was actually of Mayan descent, and actually brought into as a translator server within the population of the Tlaxcalas, which were east of Mexico. And of course, she was able to help an alliance with the Tlaxcala and Montezuma. And now, if we think about it, she is the first indigenous woman in a lot of in time and place. And it's pretty awesome to believe that her memory through all these communities is danced in the Pueblos and in Genízaro communities. So that's just one kind of, to me, a profound example.
Well, wonderful. You have such a rich presentation, and there's so many avenues we could try to pursue. But for the interest of time, just ask as a final question, if you had any final comments you'd like to make before we wrap up for today.
Yeah, I think what's important is that we look at how Genízaro culture has been left out of the story. So I think the important, even in my daily reflections on my research and work, it's for remembering that that this history is fluid, and it doesn't just matter to us as Genízaros, because what's embedded is the memory of all the communities that has suffered from the forced removals. So, if we take the tricultural myth, and we don't acknowledge the Utes had a presence in New Mexico. The Utes were moved out of New Mexico. Very rarely do you hear land recognition statements of the memory of the Ute. The Kiowa were also based in southeastern New Mexico. And that memory is forgotten. Northeastern New Mexico, the Kiowa, the Comanche were full. I mean, like I said, in San Antonio feast day for Santa Clara Pueblo, they do Comanches. I do think they also do that at Sandia Pueblo and San Antonio Day. The Comanche and oral history are revered here. They're not reflected on, like, if you think about their territory, it was pretty much all of eastern New Mexico. The people of Salinas missions are not brought in our memory. The Humano people that populated this also. I have one reflection I want to acknowledge as a community, as the Pueblo of Tortugas in Las Cruces, New Mexico. They embody, because after the Pueblo revolt, even some of those Humanos and Tompitos and even Genízaros that left landed up populating that village, and they have oral history. So what I think the important thing about learning history of New Mexico and about the Genízaros is we honor the relationship with our relatives, the Utes and the Comanche, and the Humanos, that their stories are left out. And we have to remember that forced relocations, we can't allow that memory to not be part of our contemporary awareness.
Well, thank you. What a fine finish. I really appreciate that, and I'm sure the community, our audience does as well. I want to thank you for, again, most informative, enlightening presentation. And we came away with a much clearer understanding of the Genízaro community, its past and present role in New Mexico.
Thank you, Ben, and thank you, Friends of History.
For our audience, as you know, this lecture is pre-recorded, so there is no opportunity for you as the audience to ask any questions or comments you may have in real time. However, Moises would be happy to respond to any such queries and comments. Just email him directly via the email provided below. In closing, a reminder to our listeners to visit our webpage at friendsofhistorynm.org, where you can rewatch this lecture and other Friends of History First Wednesday lectures, which cover a wide range of topics about New Mexico and more broadly Southwestern history. Click on the lecture series link at the top of that Friends of History homepage, then go to past lectures to see the list. If you wish to learn more about our upcoming lectures, or more broadly, the Friends of History, we encourage you to join our mailing list by emailing us at the email below. Finally, we request that you consider making a donation to the Friends of History through our webpage, so that the Friends of History can continue to support programs at the New Mexico History Museum. Just go to the donation page on our website, and again, it's shown below. And thank you to all who have contributed to the Friends of History over the years. We look forward to seeing you in the months ahead. Thank you, and goodbye for now.